The shortest verse in the English Bible, and yet so full of meaning. Jesus wept. You may have been weeping last night when you looked at the thermometer and watched it dropping, and then at about 16 degrees this morning, wondered where in the world has the sun gone? But the good news is, just stay tuned. There's some beautiful weather ahead, Lord willing, and we're looking forward to a great week and a great improvement in those conditions. 3 weeks from today, Lord willing, we have scheduled our annual Friends Day. It's a special time here at Central. It's always well attended. It's an exciting time. Be followed by a potluck meal together. We're really looking forward to getting together for that. I hope we have a tremendous turnout for Friends Day 2022. Something different this year. Right after the morning service, we are planning to respectfully read off the names of those of our friends and loved ones, some members of this congregation who have passed away in the last 2 years during this time of pandemic, some of them because of the pandemic. We want to pay honor and respects. So don't forget, if you have a name that should be included on that list, there are little forms there in the foyer. Be sure and fill that out and get it to us. We don't want to miss anybody. It's a time when we acknowledge loss, and also a time to recognize the importance of grief in our lives. How do you cope with grief and loss? Grief and loss are part of the earthly experience. When the psalmist said, "Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy cometh in the morning," Psalms 30 and verse 5, he was holding out the promise of something very substantial, very profound, that God's people can understand and tap into. This morning is the first of 3 sermons dealing with this important subject. I'm going to call this first one, Some Fundamentals. I hope you will bear with me if I say some things here that you already know, some things that maybe you have heard in other contexts. But first of all, some fundamentals about loss. Let's talk about some facts that we need to be aware of. As I mentioned, it is inevitable as part of our earthly existence that loss will occur. It may be sudden. It may be predictable. Sudden, for example, you may be the victim of a crime someday. I hope and pray that never happens to you, but I have known of people who have been victimized by a crime, and the loss that was associated with that sudden victimization changed their life forever. That's sudden loss. Losses, on the other hand, may be more predictable. They may be, for example, losses associated with a protracted illness. You may see it coming. You may have been told by your doctor, you have MS. Your condition is going to deteriorate. There's going to be loss of physical ability and motor skills and other associated losses. And so it's predictable, but still it's loss nonetheless. Losses come in many forms. In your bulletin article this morning is an article entitled Types of Loss, and that's designed to kind of get us thinking along this line together. I hope you, if you haven't, that you'll take a few moments and read that. Notice the difference between sudden loss and predictable loss. loss is particularly challenging for children. This is one of the things that I'm afraid many didn't really get when they started imposing a lot of mandates 2 years ago on our children. By the way, it's also extremely difficult for seniors and older people. Particularly challenging for a child because a child does not tend to think abstractly and in a connected fashion until they reach a little older age. They know that there's a loss, but it's hard for them to process that, to understand the why and the wherefore and what now of loss. And then nothing can prepare us for some losses. That's a fact. I wish that I could stand here in this pulpit and adequately prepare every one of us for the losses that we surely shall experience one of these days. I can't do that. Nor is it possible for us to be prepared fully by any other means for some of the losses that life deals to us. But these losses are real. They're inevitable, and as I said, they may be sudden or they may be predictable. These are some facts. With loss comes grief. You know, we wouldn't have to deal with grief if we were machines. If we did not have the human experience and the losses associated with it. If we could just sort of steel ourselves from society so that nobody could touch me. You remember the old song, was it Simon and Garfunkel? I am a rock, I am an island. The idea there that nobody touches me, nobody can influence or affect me, I can't be hurt. Well, that's not really the way it is it? If we're going to have relationships, if we're going to exist in this world and associate with the people around us and be, as Christians are, loving, attached people in life, we're going to suffer losses. And with loss comes grief. Now let's look at some facts about grief here for a moment. Grief is not the same thing as loss. But grief might be thought of as a natural part of the healing process. When a loss occurs, we go into a period of grief. It might be thought of as part of the healing process. Remember that grief does not come and go in an orderly, confined time frame. Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, some years ago, wrote a book entitled Death and Dying, where she outlined what she called the 5 stages of grief. This has some value, but I would caution us to be careful placing undue value upon the concept, because grief, it turns out, does not come and go in an orderly, confined time frame. Here were the stages as she outlined them in that book, which actually didn't deal so much with grief and loss in the broader context, but with her own or with impending death. And incidentally, I appreciated so much the songs that were led this morning. I don't know if you detected, but many of the songs centered on a common theme, and it so happens that they really tied in well with the thoughts of this morning's sermon with regard to grief and loss. But she said, first, when a loss occurs, people tend to go through the anger stage. What? That can't be. And we develop a sort of inward anger as an initial reaction to loss many times. Secondly is denial. Wait a minute. Did I hear that right? Surely that's not true. Never forget, a few years ago, I was at the Freed-Hardeman Lectures. And I happened to see, and I don't remember if it was on Facebook or what, but some kind of post that indicated that a very near and dear friend of mine, in fact, he had been my roommate at Freed-Hardeman for 4 years, had passed away, and that it had just happened. My initial reaction to that was, this is a cruel hoax of some kind. This can't be. Bob Lloyd was my age. This has been a few years ago. And as it turns out, he was leaving home that morning. He lived in Columbia, Tennessee, doing what he would every workday morning. He was driving to work, and on a curvy road, a logging truck happened to be coming the other way. And it lost its load right at the exact moment of all things. And I feel sure, and I feel assured that Bob never knew what hit him. And it turns out it was true. But my first reaction to that was denial. Then Dr. Kubler-Ross suggested the third stage is bargaining. That stage where we sort of accept it in part. But surely there must be some mitigation, some softening of the blow. The fourth stage she identified was depression. After a person experiences loss, they go through these first 4 stages, the fourth being depression. And then fifth, finally, acceptance. Well, that may be helpful to you to think of these processes, but what I find is sometimes people almost beat themselves up because, as it turns out, it doesn't progress in an orderly fashion. And they actually are questioning themselves, why am I feeling this way? I thought I was through that stage. I thought I was through the anger stage, and yet here I am depressed and still feeling angry. And as it turns out, grief doesn't work through a linear progression all of the time. It may bounce around back and forth. Grief is the process that God uses to bring us to a place of wholeness. And in that sense, grief can be thought of as a good thing. If you are experiencing grief this morning, don't despair. Don't conclude that there must be something wrong with me because I am going through this process of grief. As a matter of fact, it may be very, very healthy and ultimately productive because it's God's method for bringing us to a place of wholeness. Well, our culture here in the United States of America may not always get that. You've been mourning for 3 months. Isn't it time to snap out of it and get with it? That's what the culture says sometimes. Our culture tends to rush the grief process. Incidentally, this isn't the case so much in some other cultures. In the Middle East, for example, where it is routinely expected that the grief associated with the loss of the loved one will endure for at least a year in outward manifestations before a person begins to regain some semblance of normal functioning. Here in the United States, for some reason, we think once the funeral is over, the funeral director's bill is paid, it's time to get back. Well, wait, not so fast. Culturally, grief may need time to run its course, despite what others are saying. Which brings us to another fact about grief. Grief is personal. It is unique in how it is experienced and manifested by any one or two people. The things that you go through as an individual upon suffering some loss may not be exactly the same things that another person goes through. I'll talk about this more, Lord willing, in the future, but husbands and wives may not process grief in the same way. In fact, very commonly, they will process it in very different ways. And then also, grief is not the same thing as mourning, and this is something that we need to keep in mind. Dr. Alan Wolfel said that grief is internal. Our thoughts, our feelings, our private responses, our bereavement. And if not released, it can be carried. Whereas mourning is more of an external act or ritual, if you will. It is the shared social response to loss. Used to be in our country, when someone suffered the loss of a close loved one, a woman in particular would wear black as a sign of mourning. It was a social custom. And it was almost taboo not to do so. So mourning is external. It's grief gone public. It is a ritual that activates social support because other people see, hey, I can recognize you are grieving a loss at this time. What do the scriptures say about grief? It turns out that the Bible has a very great lot to say about grief. It turns out that we are serving a God who is concerned about our losses, about our grief, and has given us guideposts and instructions and the encouragement and motivation that we need to move past these in an orderly way so that we can live that full and abundant life that Jesus promised. You remember John 10 and verse 10. Well, let's see what some of these verses say. Psalms 56 and verse 8. You may want to make a note of this. Doesn't surprise us, does it, that the first place we go is the book of Psalms. The book of Psalms is a devotional book. It is a poetic book. As we mentioned in Bible class this morning, it was originally composed with the intention of being sung. The Psalms were put to music. Wouldn't it be interesting if we could actually hear these beautiful poems as they were originally sung? But that is lost to us. Still, we can almost hear it as we read through these beautiful devotional expressions in the book of Psalms. David says, "Thou numberest my wanderings." And some translations have the word miseries there. God, you are numbering, you are keeping track of my wanderings, my miseries. Put thou my tears into thy bottle. Are they not in thy book? What does that say? It says, friends, that God notices when his people are grieving. God is not a detached God. The God of the Bible is intimately concerned about and involved in the lives of his people. Are you grieving? God knows that. God notices that. God recognizes. You know, sometimes folks will come to services here at the church building after suffering some very serious loss. And it's not uncommon that at first they may say, you know what, brother so-and-so or sister so-and-so didn't even ask me about this. The preacher never even mentioned it. The elders never asked me. Now, there are many reasons why that happens. I'd like to say that there are always good reasons. I mean, sometimes they are good reasons, but many times, frankly, it's simply because we are fallible, weak, sometimes stupid people. We forget. We are insensitive sometimes, and we just neglect to express interest. But you know what? God notices. Every single time you experience loss, you can count on it. The God of the Bible notices that. Look at Psalms 34 and verse 18. Jehovah is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as are of a contrite spirit. Not only does God notice when you are grieving, God is near you when you are grieving. One of the most meaningful things that you can do for somebody who is grieving, say in the hospital, when they're sitting on that bench outside of the room or down the hall in that quiet little alcove off to it themselves, you can sit down beside them. But what do I say, preacher? Don't say anything. Just sit down beside them. God is near to the brokenhearted. What's he saying there? He's saying, I'm here for you. I am here when you're ready, when you need me. If there's anything that I can do, I don't have to say that. My nearness and my presence says it all. Or Psalms 145 and verse 14, Jehovah upholdeth all that fall and raiseth up all those that are bowed down. Now notice the progression here. God notices when his people are grieving. God is near his people who are grieving. Now this verse teaches that God actively helps people who are grieving. Isn't it interesting that God knows exactly what I need? My Jesus knows just what I need, the song says. How true that is. But this verse teaches that God actively provides it. Do you realize that sometimes God is helping you when you don't even realize it? Do you realize that help is coming to you from God in various ways? Through various agents or channels, that God is able to do that. Isaiah chapter 53, verses 3 and 4. Beautiful prophetic chapter in the book of Isaiah about the Messiah. But notice especially these verses concerning grief. He was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. You know, this is a prophecy of Jesus Christ. What was Jesus thinking about when, as he approached the dark days of the end of his earthly life, and the text says very plainly but sadly, all of his disciples forsook him and fled. What was Jesus thinking about? When he could, as it were, find a dim, distant section of the Garden of Gethsemane and there meditate and think and pray to God the Father, what thoughts filled his mind? Well, the prophet says he was despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and he sure knew about grief. And as one from whom men hide their face, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. This teaches that God, and I would put in parentheses, Jesus Christ, understands what it is to grieve. He understands because he's gone through that process himself. Or John chapter 11, verses 32 through 35, again coming back to the reading, Mary, therefore, when she came where Jesus was and saw him, fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here. Think of that question. If thou had been here. my mother had not died. My brother, rather, had not died. She's talking about Lazarus. Lord, if you had just been here. I heard about an uncle who received a call one day from his oldest son, who was obviously very upset. Dad, I need to talk with you. Unfortunately, the father was not able to talk at that moment. Immediately after that, that son took his own life. You talk about living with guilt, with pain, with loss, with grieving the loss of your son. Well, if he had just been here, what they're saying is, Jesus, if you had just been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. Well, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, that's Mary, and the Jews also weeping who came with her. Now stop for a minute. Have you ever seen people grieving, crying, moaning, wailing? Have you been watching the news for the last week or two? Have you seen the human anguish of heart that is so cruelly imposed upon them by those who have no regard for the feelings of another? Have you seen the heart of a child broken in two? When Jesus saw the pain on their faces and saw them weeping and crying, it touched him. He felt that. The verse says he groaned in spirit and was troubled. He wasn't the type of person who could see that pain and then just go on about his affairs like everything is fine. This is the Lord that we serve. And he said, where have you laid him? They say unto him, Lord, come and see. And then this verse, Jesus wept. John 11:35. Does Jesus care when my heart is pained too deeply for mirth and song? Oh, yes, he cares. I know he cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. Jesus himself is touched by our grief. And then the last of these verses, 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and 14, Paul says, but we would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning them that fall asleep. That's a euphemism. It's a kind way of referring to those of our brethren who die before we do. Paul's saying, I don't want you to be ignorant about them, concerning them that fall asleep. Now watch this. That ye sorrow not, even as the rest who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so them also that are fallen asleep in Jesus will God bring with him. The grief and sorrow of God's people is different than that of the world. It's different. If you are not a Christian this morning, I'm going to invite you to experience a new kind of sorrow. Now, that may sound strange, but I'm not going to offer and promise you that as a Christian you'll have no pain, no sorrow. Paul doesn't say that ye sorrow not, period. He says, but that ye sorrow not, even as the rest who have no hope. Are you ready to be in a right relationship with God, with Jesus Christ, so that when the sorrows and the losses of the world come your way, you can approach them and handle them and process them as a Christian? Not as the world. Brothers and sisters, God gives us this. He's saying to us, here it is. My peace I give unto you, not as the world knoweth. My ease of heart, my comfort, my life. If that's for you this morning, we're going to be at the front here ready to receive you if you need to come forward, and especially if you need to put him on in baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. What a tremendous thing. If we may assist you in your obedience to the gospel, please come while together we stand and sing.